Saddle Up for Murder, a Carson Stables mystery, Book 2, by Leigh Hearon, narrated by Laura Jennings. Prologue. Tuesday, April 26th. Ashley Lawton dug into her jacket pocket and pulled out a key, a single strand of green yarn fluttering from the top. She turned to the woman beside her and said proudly, "Mrs. Carr lets me have my own. It's not strictly company policy, but she can't move around very well, and it takes her a long time to get to the door." Her companion nodded appreciatively. She was a willowy brunette, dressed in an old-fashioned jumper. Ashley acknowledged her friend's tacit approval with a quick return nod and inserted the key into the lock in front of her. The knob turned, and she leaned inside, calling out, "Mrs. Carr? It's Ashley. I've brought a friend." They stepped into a small vestibule in a tropical climate. Spring may have arrived on the Olympic Peninsula, but Mrs. Carr's comfort apparently required a higher temperature. Ashley rushed to the thermostat on the wall and peered at the setting. She must have forgotten to turn it down. Ashley gave a small, embarrassed laugh. She gets cold a lot. "How old did you say she was?" Ashley's friend was still standing by the door, hesitant to venture farther. "She'll be 96 on her next birthday, and still has every one of her brain cells. She's amazing." "Wow. I want to meet her. Right this way." Ashley walked through a hopelessly cluttered living room, picking up dog-eared magazines and crocheted blankets along the way, and throwing them onto a sagging love seat. She navigated as someone who knew the house and the habits of its occupant. "Mrs. Carr? I'm coming into your bedroom. It's 10 o'clock. Time for your pills." The two women walked down a hallway crowded with old family photos, long faded from the passage of time. Ashley pushed open the bedroom door. "Mrs. Carr?" Her friend stood on tiptoe to look over her. Mrs. Carr's form was barely discernible in the large four-poster bed that took up most of the bedroom. The bed was piled high with comforters in a rainbow of colors. A reasonable person might wonder whether the woman was there at all. "That's odd. Usually she's sitting up by now." Ashley walked quickly over to the side of the bed and lifted one comforter, then another, at least from the neck up. But there was no vitality left in her face. Her wide-open eyes had sunk deep into the sockets, and the pallor of her skin was pasty white. Ashley tugged at the comforter, and a claw-like hand emerged, grasping the edge of the cloth, seeming to resist any attempt to take away her last bit of warmth. "She's dead." Ashley's voice registered astonishment. Behind her, her friend slid to the floor in a dead faint. Chapter 1. Monday, May 2nd. A piercing shriek brought Annie Carson out of her reverie, not to mention her rear firmly back down on her saddle. She'd been standing in her stirrups to get the maximum view of her sheep pasture. It was a panoramic view. Her mount was a 16-hand thoroughbred, which already put her more than 5 feet off the ground. The sight of 75 ewes and as many lambs in the grassy lee reminded Annie of a constable painting she'd once seen in a museum. Even the billowing clouds overhead looked painted. Now she wheeled Trooper around and nudged him forward. The horse took off at a hard canter, turning abruptly in response to Annie's rein into the trailhead of an old logging road. She pulled the horse up short a few seconds later. "Hannah, thank God you're safe." "Shh." If Annie thought it odd that an 8-year-old, who'd just issued an ear-splitting scream, was now telling her to be quiet, she didn't say so. Instead, she calmly walked her horse closer to Hannah's. Bess, fortunately, was not making any noise. She was munching grass very quietly. "What's going on?" Annie kept her voice neutral. "I saw someone in the woods. A man. I think he had a gun." Annie scanned the thick trees in front of her. It was early May, and the Pacific Northwest was in the full flower of spring. She saw nothing but a suffusion of ferns and undergrowth forming a luxuriant pillow against densely packed Douglas fir. What was the man doing? Hiding. He was behind a tree. Then I saw him run to another one. I didn't scream until I saw his weapon. Hannah's father ran a security business that included transporting Loomis trucks filled with cash from local businesses. She was well acquainted with different caliber handguns and shotguns. What kind of weapon? I'm not sure. I think it was a pistol. But I screamed, and then he ran away back there. Hannah pointed with her left arm into the woods. Just a little, but I thought if I screamed, he'd go away. If he started to shoot at me, I figured I'd just gallop away. Maybe. Annie was sure Hannah had every intention of galloping away. The problem was Bess, Annie's 25-year-old Morgan, who thought indulging in anything beyond a stately walk did not befit her dignified age. What did Bess do when you screamed? Grazed. So much for Hannah's fast getaway from the bad guy. But Annie was more concerned about Hannah's near encounter than she let on to her little companion. The sound of shifting leaves caught both riders unawares. They started and whipped around in their saddles. Hannah clapped her hands over her mouth to make sure another scream wasn't forthcoming. From the dark forest floor, a fawn emerged, almost perfectly camouflaged against the lush green backdrop. Walking carefully on its long and spindly legs, it wended its way through the thicket and out of sight. Hannah and Annie remained motionless on their saddles. "A fawn," breathed Hannah. "A baby deer. I thought I was going to jump out of my saddle, Annie, but I didn't. Even Bess jumped. A little." "That's because you're nice and relaxed in your seat, Hannah," Annie replied. "So when something like this happens, it's easy to stay balanced." Annie was a stickler and told all of her riding students not to grip the horse's ribs with their knees. It didn't help their equilibrium, and it impacted their horse's ability to move freely. Hannah looked thoughtfully at Annie and nodded. "Do you think the fawn will find its mother?" "I'm sure it will. The fawn isn't going to move far just because a couple of horses are passing through. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a deer clearing in the next 100 feet. Let's go find it." "Nice try, kiddo. Fawns only want to be found by their mommies. Besides, hot chocolate awaits us." This was the traditional ending to Hannah's riding lesson, and afterward Annie had driven the little girl to her doorstep. Usually she let Hannah walk back to her home through a well-worn path. After all, the Clare household was only a quarter-mile away. But now Annie recalled recent news stories of young children who'd been abducted just a short distance from their own homes, and she had no intention of taking unnecessary chances. Taking care of her own safety was just as important. When Annie had opened Carson Stables, her training facility for equines, every man she'd encountered had flat out told her that a single woman who weighed a mere 125 pounds would never be able to handle the workload, let alone adequately protect herself from things that went, "Don't expect me to come to your rescue every time you hear a scary noise in the woods," Sawana Sheriff Dan Stetson had grumbled after she'd dismissed his advice for the 10th time. Annie had merely laughed. "I won't," was her breezy reply. That conversation had occurred 15 years ago. In the intervening time, she'd proven Dan and everyone else wrong. Not one of her detractors knew how hard she worked to make sure no harm came to her or her animals. She'd learned that the best way to keep danger from coming to her doorstep was to meet it head-on. After dropping off Hannah, she parked her F-250 near the stables and called for Trooper, now contently munching on a flake of orchard grass in the paddock. It was time to find out exactly who had been lurking off the old logging road. If the man Hannah had seen was simply taking a shortcut through her property, he'd be long gone by now. She certainly hoped so.